Ian, could you tell us a little about how you first became interested in the graphics and the logos you saw on the side of rolling stock in the States?
Well, it was the first time I went to New York, or the first time to America, actually. We were there to do a British week at Macy's, and we were there with people like Terence Conran and Robert Carrier and lots of other designers. And on the Sunday, we were free, and a friend lent us a Ford Mustang, which was rather wonderful. And we drove, a friend of mine, Rodney Kinsman, and I drove up to Bear Mountain, and we turned off into a small town, an industrial town, which was rather dying, called Cold Springs. And we were in a bar sitting chatting to these guys, and I heard this train. So I went out of the bar, and there the road was closed off, and there's a railroad track, and I stood there, waited for the train. And lo and behold, this wonderful General Motors F unit came by with 6-foot graphics on the side saying Rock Island. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And the freight cars that came by, the first one was Southern, the huge round logo saying through the heart of the South. And I just thought, I'd never seen graphics like this. This was real super graphics. And I just thought, I've got to do something about it. I've got to photograph them.
And you did.
Yes. I think when I got back that first time, I started looking at train magazines, American train magazines. And it was a real eye-opener because in a lot of the photographs, you could see these freight cars with these wonderful strap lines on the side. And I thought, my God, I've never seen anything like these graphics. So I went back, and of course, we're talking about before the internet. And so I had to sort of do it on the hoof. And I stayed with a friend in New York, and I told him about it. And he said, well, let's go and walk down to one of the railroad tracks, which we did. Behind the New York Times building, there was a big railroad track. And I just stood there on the track taking photographs of various freight cars going by. And I remember that evening we got back and I was again chatting about it. And I thought, I'm going to go to California anyway, because it was Christmas. I was going to stay with friends there. And so I phoned Union Pacific and said, is there any chance that I could travel on one of your trains? Because I'm doing this book on the graphics and logos. And they said to me, if you can get to Chicago tomorrow, we'll get you on the Zephyr, which is going to San Francisco where you want to go, and we'll get you in the cab. So I couldn't believe this. I just thought, my God. And the thing is, because I'd not prepared for it, I missed a tremendous amount by not being prepared. But I did get to Chicago, and it was 20 degrees below, and I got to Union Station, and I was standing outside, and there was a fire in a glass factory. And I was looking at these firemen. They were just covered in sheets of ice, and the cars in the street, you could see through this ice to these cars sitting there where the water had sprayed off the hoses. Anyway, I got to the station. A ticket agent met me and said, well, you can go in the cab now, or we've reserved you a room. And as it was nighttime, I went to the room, and in the morning I walked up through and went to the cab.
And you travelled
across to San Francisco, and with the engineer, who wouldn't really talk to me. I think I was a bit of an unknown quantity to him. It was like somebody from Mars. And I tried to be friendly, and eventually he was friendly. But I remember saying to him as we were going across Nebraska, I said, I gather on Union Pacific you were given a stopwatch, a big gold stopwatch for the milepost. Said, I don't know anything about that. Anyway, we were traveling along, And I could see in front of me a station must have been about 2 or 3 miles away. And I said, where are we coming into now? He said, the Cheyenne. We're in Wyoming. And I said, but I can see people on horseback. He said, it's a cow town. He said, what do you expect? And I thought, and then he looked at me and he said, you want to pull the horn? And I thought, oh my God, this is it. And I pulled this cord and these air horns were going, oh, wonderful sound, wonderful sound. And by this time I was starting to see on stations lots of graphics. And we stopped at Cheyenne and we were there for about, 20 minutes. And I jumped out and I photographed the station. And I was beginning to sense that this was a whole new experience.
Mm-hmm. And you've been back many times.
Many times since then, many times. On that particular trip, I ended up in San Francisco, in the station actually, and photographed the station. Thank God I did, because 6 months later they pulled it down. And from there I went, I spent time with a friend and we went up to his place in Salinas, which was rather wonderful because it's all very open. And I remember on Christmas morning, I got up very early and walked down to where I could see there was a railroad track and there was a freight train across the vegetables, which I photographed. And there was also a train wreckage there. Mm-hmm. So I managed to get lots of photographs of Logos there. And then I went down to Los Angeles and spent quite a lot of time in the Vernon Yards, I think it was, in Los Angeles. And I realized later on that I was actually trespassing on all that stuff. But I didn't realize. I mean, it was just, I just walked in and took photographs. Nobody said anything.
You never got arrested?
No, didn't get arrested. And from there, because I started talking to lots of guys on the railroad, they said, well, you probably ought to go to Kansas City, because at the moment, what they're doing is that the whole of the middle of Kansas City is covered in freight cars because they're shipping all the grain to Russia. So I flew down to Kansas City, and I then got permission to go in one of the big yards there. I can't remember which one it was, but it was pretty huge. And the ticket agent was telling me that guys who walk around the yards have to walk around with electric sticks because of wild dogs, which sounded pretty horrible. And while we were there, I watched this train coming round the bend into the yards very, very slowly. And it stopped, and the engineer leaned out and said, what are you guys doing? And I said, oh, I'm photographing a train. The ticket agent said, he's doing a book. He wants to photograph your train. And he looked at me and said, you want to photograph my engine? And I said, yeah, I can do it from here. And he said, and I saw him get on the radio. And I thought, what the hell is he doing? Anyway, the next minute, he'd started backing the train back down the track. He got out, unhitched it, brought his engine forward. I thought, my God. And I photographed it. And I said to the ticket agent, where's this train come from? He said, well, this one's come up from Texas and it's 4 miles long. And he was radioing the guys in the train at the back, which was extraordinary. And of course, I was just in awe of all these graphics. And because I hadn't really planned it, everything was on the hoof.
Yeah. Now, you are a designer, and
Yes.
You were very much a part of the British design revolution of the late 60s and 70s. So what was it about the graphics of the American railroads that you saw on the side of locomotives and rolling stock, and also the merchandising, the timetables, and all the other things which I understand you've been collecting now for many years? What was it about this distinctive visual language that struck you?
I think that at that particular time, there was also a big movement in America with graphic design. When I mentioned super graphics, there was a whole thing about super graphics at that time. And somehow I was relating it to what was on the railroads, because I saw it as not a folk art, but it wasn't designed by designers, which I found fascinating, because it was designed with a passion somehow. And it wasn't like design is nowadays, where it becomes a strategy and a room full of books convincing the client that this is the best thing to do. These guys were drawing it on matchboxes or whatever and saying that's what we should have as a logo. And there was something totally fascinating about that I thought was wonderful. And the more I went into it, the more it became totally fascinating.
Yeah. Didn't you say that the logo of the Santa Fe, which is a cross in a circle, was drawn by a passenger agent drawing around a silver dollar?
That's exactly what happened. Just he drew around a silver dollar and just put the Santa Fe in it, which is lovely, and it works. You know, fantastic. And there are obviously, the more I went into it, the wonderful stories like the Lackawanna Railroad, where it was all to get passengers. And we're talking about really the 30s and the 40s and the early 50s, when it started dying out because of the airlines. But the sort of advertising to get people on the trains, the Santa Fe, that wonderful adverts of she came in on the Super Chief, of course, the film star arriving with her cases. And there are wonderful pictures now you can find on the internet of Humphrey Bogart and people arriving in their suits off the Chief, the Super Chief, which is wonderful. And because that's how they all travelled. So it is that particular period that fascinated me. Also, I was very, very lucky to come in right at the end of the railroad thing, because if I hadn't taken the photographs of all the freight cars, they would have been covered in graffiti, which is what they are now. Mm-hmm. And I took it before the graffiti happened, which was wonderful.
And you also caught the tail end of the streamline era, which was, if you like, the sort of the last hurrah of American passenger rail, although freight transport is still going strong. Yeah. And it was a very distinctive design movement, closely associated with Art Deco, of course. Would you have anything particular to say about that?
Well, I think that I mean, when I was there, it really was freight, and the only thing that was sort of left were the logos on the side of the freight cars. Mm-hmm. The route of the 400 streamliners, the route of Phoebe Snow, the route of the Super Chief, the Texas Chief, the route of the Rebels. They were still there on the freight cars, but there weren't really any passenger. Only Amtrak had started when I was there. Mm-hmm. So it was later on that I started going into the wonderful things like the Zephyrs, the early Zephyrs, which are stainless steel. I forget who they were made by, actually. Was it Baldwin? I can't remember who they were made by. General Motors were the big company, and General Electric were the big companies that made the trains. Baldwin. Alco was another one that made the engine. And I don't think they exist anymore. I think the Canadians are the only ones that make the trains.
All their museum pieces.
I
mean, the one thing about the book is the focus on the graphics. There are many, many books have been written about the American railroads, obviously because of their glamour and their epic scope. But this book takes a unique focus on this particular visual language that you mentioned and you enthuse about, because it was in many ways came out of the industry itself rather than
absolutely. Yeah. No, yes, I think that that's the nice thing about it, was that it was a lot of the logos came from competitions with railroad people.
Mm-hmm.
They put the competition out for a logo, and maybe a ticket agent or an engineer would draw up something and they adapt it and put it on their trains, which is fantastic.
Many of these logos can be found within the pages of Logomotive, along with a wide selection of ephemera, timetables, placemats, posters, matchbooks that were used to promote the railroads, alongside the 35mm transparencies that Ian took on his journeys. It's a rich and varied and absolutely fascinating glimpse into a vanished world.